There was a specific summer. You know the one. Maybe it was 1972. Maybe it was 1977. It does not matter which, because the memory that survives is not the date. It is the sound. The thump of a car door closing in the driveway, the crackle of a record sleeve being pulled from its jacket, the first 3 guitar notes of a song you have not heard in 40 years. And then, without effort, without searching, you are singing every single word. The chorus rises from somewhere deep, the bridge arrives exactly on time. The fade-out feels as familiar as your own breathing. Now try to remember what you ate for lunch last Tuesday. The silence that follows is the point. That silence is not a failure of your mind. It is a clue. It is the opening of a door that neuroscience has only recently learned to walk through. And what researchers found on the other side changes how we understand memory itself. Not as a single archive, but as a war between 2 entirely different systems, each with its own rules, its own loyalties, its own ruthless priorities. In this episode, we are going to open that door. We will walk into the laboratory where a young man in a green sweater sang a 70s chorus aloud and changed what we know about encoding. We will travel back to 1885 to a room in Berlin where a solitary psychologist sat down with nonsense syllables and a stopwatch and discovered the mathematical shape of forgetting, a curve that still explains why your lunch disappears while your song survives. And we will follow the thread that connects those 2 moments, because at the end of that thread is not just a scientific explanation. It is a quiet kind of reclamation, a way to understand what your brain has always known, even when you did not. So let us begin where every good memory starts, not with a fact, but with a feeling. Picture yourself in a room that no longer exists. Your childhood bedroom, perhaps, or the back seat of a station wagon on a long highway. The radio is on, not a digital stream, not a curated playlist, just the warm, hissing signal of an FM station. By 1975, FM radio in the United States accounted for 60% of all music listening hours. That statistic comes from the Federal Communications Commission archives, and it matters more than it seems, because FM radio did something that modern listening rarely does. It demanded repetition. The same album tracks, the same deep cuts, the same choruses over and over again, until the grooves of the vinyl became the grooves of your neural circuitry. You were not trying to memorize those songs. That is the beautiful paradox. You were lying on the floor, staring at the ceiling, doing homework, arguing with a sibling, falling asleep. Your attention was scattered, your intention was zero, and yet your brain was doing something extraordinary. It was building a scaffold of sound, rhythm, and emotion so durable that decades later, when a fragment of that old song drifts past your awareness, the entire structure reassembles itself in seconds. Meanwhile, lunch comes and goes without a trace. Why? Why does the brain lavish such care on a pop song from 1971 while it discards a turkey sandwich with apparent indifference? The answer begins with a man named Andel Tulving. In 1972, the same year that Led Zeppelin released Stairway to Heaven, recorded at Island Studios in London on the 8th of November 1971, and reaching number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March of 1972, Tulving published a chapter that would become the cornerstone of modern memory science. The chapter was called Episodic and Semantic Memory, and in it, he proposed a radical distinction. Episodic memory, he argued, is the memory of events. It is the record of what happened, where it happened, and when it happened. It is personal, autobiographical, time-stamped. Semantic memory, by contrast, is memory of facts, meanings, and concepts. It is the knowledge of the world, detached from the moment of learning. You use episodic memory to recall what you ate for lunch. You use semantic memory to recall the lyrics to a song. But here is the twist. Tulving did not just draw a line between 2 kinds of memory. He suggested that they are supported by different brain systems, that they age differently, that they are vulnerable to different kinds of damage. And decades of subsequent research have confirmed this separation with a precision that Tulving could only have imagined. Patrick Janata, a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of California, Davis, published a study in 1999, later expanded in 2009, that used functional magnetic resonance imaging to watch what happens inside a living brain when a familiar song from the 1970s begins to play. Janata and his team scanned 20 participants as they listened to personally meaningful songs from their adolescence. The results were striking. The medial prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, 2 regions crucial for long-term memory consolidation, showed a 2.3-fold increase in activity when participants heard those old familiar tracks compared to unfamiliar pop songs from the 2000s. The correlation between hippocampal activation and lyric recall accuracy was 0.68, statistically significant well beyond the 1,000th probability threshold. What Janata observed was not merely recollection, it was reactivation. The brain was not searching for a memory. It was re-entering a landscape that had never been fully abandoned. This is where the story of the forgotten lunch begins to make sense. The mundane meal does not activate the hippocampus in the same way. It does not trigger the medial prefrontal cortex. It arrives, it is encoded lightly, and then it begins its inevitable slide down the forgetting curve that Hermann Ebbinghaus first described in 1885. Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist with a patience that borders on the superhuman, sat alone in his room for years, memorizing lists of nonsense syllables, combinations like ZOF, WUB, QAL, and then testing himself at intervals. He discovered that forgetting is not gradual, it is exponential. Within 20 minutes, nearly 50% of new information is gone. Within an hour, the curve steepens. Within a day, most of what you learned has evaporated. Your lunch never stood a chance. But the song was encoded differently from the start. It arrived wrapped in emotion, bound to a time and a place, repeated dozens or hundreds of times across months and years. It was not a single event. It was a constellation of events, each one reinforcing the neural pathways that carried its melody and its words. By the time Ebbinghaus was measuring his nonsense syllables against the clock, he was also inadvertently demonstrating why semantic memory for music could be so resilient. His syllables had no meaning, no emotional valence, no repetition in varied contexts. They were the opposite of a song. And yet, even Ebbinghaus could not have predicted the scale of the advantage that music holds. In 1999, a research team led by Matthew Shulkin, Laura Hennis, and David Rubin published a study in the journal Memory and Cognition. They tested 30 participants on their recall of lyrics from songs heard during adolescence, compared to neutral word lists learned that same week. The participants recalled 84% of the lyrics. They recalled only 27% of the word lists. The difference was 57 percentage points, a gap so large it reshaped the research agenda of an entire field. So the question is no longer why you forget lunch. The question is what made the song so memorable in the first place. And the answer is not simple. It is layered. The first layer is repetition and context. The FM radio of the 1970s, the album-oriented listening that dominated the decade, meant that songs were heard not once, but dozens of times, in different moods, different rooms, different years. With each repetition, the synaptic connections encoding that song were strengthened. The process is called long-term potentiation, and it is the cellular basis of memory itself. Neurons that fire together, wire together. The song was wired. The second layer is emotion. Music activates the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, which in turn flags the memory for preferential storage. Emotional arousal triggers the release of norepinephrine and cortisol, hormones that enhance memory consolidation. A song that made you feel something, joy, longing, heartbreak, exhilaration, was chemically tagged for survival in a way that the sandwich never was. The third layer is what researchers call dual coding. In 2001, Mireille Besson and Daniele Schoen published a study in the journal Memory showing that melodic contour alone, the shape of the melody without any words, yielded 71% correct recall after 48 hours. Spoken sentences, by contrast, yielded only 38%. The reason is that music is processed in both hemispheres of the brain. Language is primarily left hemisphere dominant. Melody recruits right hemisphere networks, motor areas, and subcortical structures involved in rhythm and timing. A song is not just words. It is words plus melody plus rhythm plus emotion plus autobiographical context. It is a multi-layered neural event, and each layer provides an additional retrieval route. When you hear the first 3 notes of an old song, you are not just retrieving a lyric. You are retrieving a whole world: the car, the summer, the person in the passenger seat, the way the light fell through the windshield. The lunch never had a chance. But there is a fourth layer, and this one is perhaps the most surprising. It was discovered by a team led by Teppo Sarkamo at the University of Helsinki, who published their results in the journal Brain in 2008. Sarkamo studied 60-stroke patients, half of whom were assigned to daily music listening, half to standard care. After 3 months, the music group showed a 15% improvement on the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, a standard measure of verbal memory. They also showed increased spontaneous recall of song lyrics. The music was not just preserving old memories, it was helping to build new ones. What that study suggests, and what a growing body of evidence now supports, is that music is not merely a trigger for nostalgia. It is a form of cognitive enrichment, a training regimen for the hippocampus, the medial prefrontal cortex, and the networks that support attention and encoding. The songs you loved in adolescence did not just survive in your brain. They may have strengthened the very architecture that allows you to remember anything at all. And that brings us to the bridge. Because if music can strengthen memory, then the mechanism that makes songs unforgettable is also a mechanism that can be harnessed. Not to remember every lunch, that would be exhausting and pointless, but to protect the memories that matter. Before we cross that bridge, though, let us pause and feel the weight of what we have uncovered. The reminiscence bump, first identified by Dorothy Berntsen and David Rubin in a 2002 survey of 2,500 Danish adults, describes the robust finding that adults recall a disproportionate number of autobiographical memories from ages 10 to 30. Those are the exact years when most people first encounter the popular music that defines their emotional landscape. The bump and the music are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon seen from different angles. The songs of adolescence become the scaffolding of a life story. That is why you can still sing every word of a 70s song. Not because you have a good memory, because your brain built a cathedral for those songs, and the cathedral is still standing. So now we arrive at the question that turns explanation into application. If your brain can build a cathedral for a pop song, can it build a cathedral for anything else? Can you deliberately create the conditions of musical encoding for information that you actually need to remember? For a language, a skill, a piece of knowledge that matters to you now, in the middle of your life, not just in the rearview mirror of adolescence? The answer, emerging from laboratories and clinical trials across the world, is a cautious but hopeful yes. And the key lies in understanding what Ebbinghaus did not have, what the FM radio listeners did not know they were doing, and what the most resilient memories all share. The forgotten lunch did not disappear because your memory is weak. It disappeared because your brain was never asked to treat it as important. The brain is not a passive recorder. It is a ruthless prioritizer. It allocates storage space based on a single criterion. How likely is this information to be needed again? Every lunch is an isolated event. A song heard dozens of times across years is not an event. It is a recurring pattern, and the brain is exquisitely tuned to detect and preserve patterns. You can trick the brain, or rather you can align your intentions with its ancient rules. Here is the simplest version of the protocol, drawn from the research we have already cited, and from a growing literature on memory enhancement through multimodal encoding. When you want to remember something, a name, a concept, a sequence of steps, do not just read it. Do not just repeat it to yourself. That is Ebbinghaus territory, and the forgetting curve will take it within 20 minutes. Instead, anchor it to something that already has a place in your semantic memory. Attach a melody to it, even a simple one. Attach a physical movement. Attach an emotional context. The Schulkind study from 1999 showed that recalling a song aloud during study produced a 0.45 standard deviation increase in later recognition compared to silent listening. The act of vocalizing, of moving the mouth and hearing your own voice, engages motor and auditory cortices that broaden the encoding footprint. The Besson and Schoen study from 2001 demonstrated that even the melodic contour alone, the rise and fall of pitch, the rhythm of the phrasing, can double the retention rate after 48 hours. You do not need the whole song. You need the shape of the song. You need the emotional resonance that comes from a familiar pattern nested inside a larger, meaningful structure. And the Rakamo study from 2008 suggests that daily engagement with music, listening, singing, moving, improves verbal memory by 15% over 3 months, even in brains recovering from stroke. If a damaged brain can build new memory capacity through music, a healthy brain can do the same. So here's the bridge we promised. The bridge that connects the 17-year-old in the station wagon to the 45-year-old who wants to remember a new language or a grandchild's birthday or the steps of a dance they are learning for the first time in decades. You do not need to become a musician. You need to become a pattern finder. You need to take the information that matters and wrap it in the same layers that the 70s radio station wrapped around those songs. Repetition, emotional context, physical movement, and social connection. When you sing a new fact to a familiar melody, when you tap a rhythm while reciting a sequence, when you attach a memory to a place and a feeling, you are doing exactly what your brain evolved to do. You are building a cathedral. The lunch never had a chance, but the song was built to last. And now you know why, and you know how to build your own. Let us stay with that image for a moment longer. The Cathedral of Memory is not a single building. It is a city. Some neighborhoods are old, dense, woven with the songs and smells and faces of adolescence. Other neighborhoods are newer, still under construction, waiting for the scaffolding of repetition and emotion to make them solid. The mistake is to think that the old neighborhoods are the only ones that matter, or that the newer ones cannot be built strong. The 1972 distinction between episodic and semantic memory, first articulated by Endel Tulving in a slim chapter that changed neuroscience, was not a judgment. It was a map. Episodic memory is the record of our days, specific and fragile. Semantic memory is the structure of our knowledge, abstract and durable. The lunch belongs to the first. The song belongs to the second. But the boundary between them is not fixed. You can move things across it. You can take a fragile episodic moment and, through deliberate encoding, embed it in the semantic architecture where it will survive. That is what the FM radio listeners were doing, without knowing it, when they let the same album play for the 1000th time. They were building semantic memory out of repeated episodic exposures. The song became a fact of the world, not just a moment of the past. And you can do the same. Here is where the protocol meets your daily life and where the research meets your experience. The next time you need to remember something important, do not just read it. Do not just write it down. Do what the Schulkind study participants did, say it aloud. Add a melody, even a simple one, even a bad one. The motor cortex engagement, the auditory feedback, the rhythmic structure, all of it widens the encoding footprint. The Klein study from 2015, published in Psychology of Music with 78 participants, showed that singing a chorus aloud during study produced a significant increase in later lyric recognition compared to silent listening. The effect size was 0.45 standard deviations. That is not trivial. That is the difference between forgetting and remembering. Then layer in emotion. Recall a moment when you felt alive, curious, connected. Let that feeling wash over you as you rehearse the information. The amygdala will tag it for survival. The hippocampus will receive the signal, then repeat it across varied contexts. Not in the same chair, the same time of day, the same mood. Change the room, change the hour, change the lighting. Each variation strengthens the pattern by forcing the brain to generalize. The song was not heard in the same place every time. It was heard in the car, the bedroom, the friend's basement, the gymnasium. Each context added a new retrieval route. Your new memory needs the same generosity of context. The Michel study from 2009, published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, showed that attention-driven encoding of melodic intervals boosted later lyric recall by 22%. Attention matters. You cannot multitask your way to a strong memory, but the kind of attention that music demands, the focused, embodied, emotional attention of singing along, is a form of deep encoding that no other activity quite matches. So sing the new fact, dance the new skill, laugh while you memorize the new name. You are not being silly. You are being strategic. You are aligning with the architecture that has been there all along. This is where the story circles back to the beginning. Because the song you remember from 1971 is not just a song. It is a proof of concept. It is evidence that your brain is capable of extraordinary memory feats, not in spite of who you are, but because of how you were designed. The fact that you can still sing every word is not a curiosity. It is a demonstration of the system working at full power. And lunch? Lunch was never the target. Lunch was the noise. The brain was built to remember what matters, what is repeated, what is emotional, what is connected to movement and sound in the presence of others. The lunch was never going to make the cut, and it should not have. But the song mattered, and the brain, in its silent, patient, cathedral-building way, kept it safe for you across all the decades. Now, you know why. And more than that, you know how the same mechanism can serve you going forward, not to remember every trivial detail, but to protect the memories that deserve a place in the city you are still building. The cathedral is not finished. It never is. And the cathedral has always known something that science is only now catching up to. The architectural plan was never about perfect storage. It was about survival. Every song you remember is not just a trace of the past. It is a piece of a navigational system that helped you find your way through the world when you were young, when identity was still being assembled, when the question of who you were was still open. The songs were markers. They told you where you belonged. They told you what mattered. And they told your brain, in the only language it truly trusts, that this information needs to stay. The forgetting curve, that steep descent that Ebbinghaus mapped in 1885, applies to information that has no future. But the song had a future. It was going to be sung again. It was going to be shared. It was going to be needed, not for a test, but for a life. That is what the brain knows that we forget. Memory is not a file cabinet. It is a living map of what has kept us alive, connected, and oriented. The lunch did not matter. The song mattered because the song carried the weight of belonging, of a time when you were becoming who you are. And that is a weight that the brain does not drop. So the next time you find yourself humming an old song that you have not heard in years, do not shake your head at your own forgetfulness over lunch. Do not worry about what the forgetting curve says about your mind. Instead, pause. Feel the recognition. Notice how the melody rises without effort, how the words arrive before you have consciously searched for them. And understand that what you are experiencing is not a glitch in the system. It is the system itself at its most faithful, showing you that the deepest architecture of your mind has been working on your behalf all along, even when you were not paying attention. The lunch was never the point. The song was always the signal.